like you said that all things go.
All right, good morning on the studio stage.
Good morning, you guys. I hope you feel better than I do.
On my feet.
You certainly look better than I do. And you certainly look better than I feel.
So, again, one of those people that actually wouldn't need any introductions at all. But as a fellow Star Trek nerd and obviously a fellow violinist of our little Neos Chamber Orchestra that is yet to be founded, but we are in the process. Welcome Bernard on stage.
So, hello, fellow Neosians, and welcome to this year's Hangover talk. It will be the third and final talk about the new content repository in Neos 9. And it will be about the content repository's PHP API. So, that's me. I'm Bernard Schmidt. I'm not really creative when it comes to social media handles. And I joined the Neos core team in 2016, so quite a few years ago. And I realized, okay, I saw that year earlier in this conference when it came to, actually, that was when we started the content repository. So that's what I've been working on in the last years. So as I really enjoy working with PHP, I'm particularly happy to present you this and take you for a walk to the lower decks of Neos. So one topic we never got tired about talking to you about was CQRS, right? So command query responsibility segregation. By now you probably already heard of it, the basics, the concept, and so on. And now that we've actually done this, let's have a look at what an application looks like that you build with this pattern. So in the old world, we had this omnipotent node model. You could get stuff like properties, for example, fair enough. You could also set stuff. You could traverse the whole tree. You could create other nodes, get the context for finding stuff, and so on. And this was split up into multiple models. For example, the read model is now a really minimal node object, which has just a few identity components, something like perspective. We'll have a look at that later. And of course, properties. And if you want to do anything actively, like changing stuff, creating, modifying, varying, and so on nodes, then there are commands for that. So before we take the deep dive, I want to remind us of a few concepts that we need to understand this. The first is perspective as opposed to identity. This is a consequence of the fallback mechanism that has been around since we have dimensions in Neos in, I think, 1.2 or something like that. That means you can have a node with a certain identity. For example, it was created in a certain language, but it can also be available in another language without actually having been translated. So the language the node was created in is part of its identity, and the language you selected in the language selector is your perspective. We will need that later on. And there may be these fallbacks even across dimensions. I mean, language is the default case that you usually use in Neos, but it's only one example of many. And when we do these tests, for example, I mean, we have that default example with specialization. So we have like German as the default language, and then Swiss German or Schweizerdeutsch as a specialization, which kind of makes sense to have a fallback to German. But not in this talk, because since I was born in Trier, we'll take Luxembourgish instead. So this is our really simple variation graph, right? You have one dimension language with German as a default and Luxembourgish as a specialization with a fallback to German. Then we have, of course, the content graph. Not only is this our primary projection that we use, it's also quite a nice mental model to kind of keep track of what's actually going on. And all hangover talks get a lot better if you have graphs in them. Oh, let's go back for a moment. So you see, basically, you have like node A, which originates in German, but is also visible in Luxembourgish, while node B is translated to Luxembourgish. There's a reference from A to B, which points to the whole aggregate, as we learned yesterday. So you just have to insert the ID at that point, and not this specific variant. And we have some child node sibling nodes. So this is basically the minimal set of nodes you need to present all the cases. So let's, we do CQS. Let's start with the read side. Reading nodes is always about perspective, because we want to have these fallback mechanisms in place. You have this language selector in your nearest UI or in the front end, wherever you put it, and you want to have this fallback mechanism. Then what we also want to provide, or wanted to provide, is a repository for nodes, right? So just like your usual flow repository or doctrine repository or any kind of repository you created, it's basically a thing you can query and you get a certain kind of object as an answer. And the content subgraph is your repository for finding nodes. The API is without nodes as parameters. That means you only always need identifiers to find something. So you don't have to already have a node to find another node. Then it's basically a replacement for parts of the content context, node data repository, and the old node model. It's basically your repository where you go to. As reading nodes is about perspective, when you fetch your subgraph, you need to define that perspective. And this is defined by 3 components. The content stream ID, it's like a Git branch, and workspaces point at them. So what you actually need is a workspace name, and you can find the rest by that. Then you have to select a dimension space point. That sounds a lot more scarier than it actually is. It's basically just a tuple of dimension values. It's like language German or language Luxembourgish. And it replaces the dimensions array and target dimensions array and node dimension objects that you had in the old API to have a really, really nice and type-safe component here. And last but not least, there are visibility constraints. Currently, they only support this disabled content shown or not. For example, if you're in the Neos UI, Neos backend, or you're writing an importer where you also want to modify disabled content, you should set this to true. Otherwise, in the front end, it's false because, these nodes are disabled for a reason, probably. So finding a subgraph is actually the only slightly difficult thing you have to do. Because, if you have like your product catalog and flow, you just inject it and you're done. And that's not so easy with subgraphs because there are so many of them. You have to define which one you want. So the thing to inject, as we learned yesterday already, is the content repository registry. There, all the different content repositories are registered, as it says in the name, that you configured in your system. So once you have the registry, there are 2 cases. Either you want to find a node from scratch, or a subgraph from scratch, then you have to select your content repository that you want to fetch the subgraph from. Usually it's default if you only have one, but there could be others, and you should probably know them because you define them yourself. Then you get that content repository, which is kind of a facade around all these services and repositories that you use in your code. Then you can fetch the content repository's content graph, which is the whole thing with all the nodes and edges. And from that, you can get the subgraph that you want to look at. And there you also have to define your perspective. So content stream ID which you can get from the workspace finder's workspace, and then the workspace current content stream ID. You have to define your dimension space point that you want to look at, and the visibility constraints. It gets a bit easier if you already have a node and want to stay in the same perspective. I try to avoid the word context wherever I can. We're so happy of being rid of that. And you can just call content repository registry subgraph for node because the node contains all information that's needed to fetch the subgraph where it was fetched from. So the subgraph API, that's where we go into speaking graphish, actually. So all these operations that it supports are basically graph operations, right? So we have, for example, a node ID, and we can just fetch the node by ID. We can find child nodes, specific child nodes, for example, the main content collection. We can find all descendants, the parent node, succeeding siblings, preceding siblings, references, and back references. That's a new feature in EOS 9. We can count most of the stuff, and there's a new concept called the subtree, where you can just find some portion of the node tree, load it in memory, and have that hierarchical structure, for example, when you want to build a menu or something like that. Then we have two deprecated methods. They're all about node paths. The idea in the old content repository is that nodes were mostly identified by their path in the tree. That's no longer the case. We use the IDs for that. And so, yes, it's still technically possible to find a node by its path or to find a path for a node. But that's actually the only operation that got slower than before because you have to traverse the whole tree and it's no longer stored in the node object itself. So whenever possible, try to use identifiers instead of paths. It just will get a lot faster. So as I said, you don't really need to have a node to find a node. So you just always pass some identifiers. So for example, find node by ID, of course, you just pass the node aggregate ID. You can find child nodes by the parent node aggregate ID. You can find the parent node by the child node aggregate ID, and so on. You can have additional parameters, for example, for this find child node connected through edge name. That would be nice to also pass the edge name. For example, main for the main content collection. And where it makes sense, these operations or queries also have a filters object. So you can, for example, say, okay, give me all descendants of a certain type or with certain property values. We'll look into that later. So what do we get if we call for nodes? I mean, obviously, that's the main use case. We get nodes. The new node replaces node, node interface, traversable node interface, and node data. So it all gets a lot easier. It contains just a few properties, actually. It's the content subgraph identity. That's this perspective is what it was fetched from, basically. You usually don't need that, but it's just carried on instead of the context. Then you have the node aggregate ID. That's the node's identifier, or the node aggregates identifier. That's formerly identifier from the old node object. Then you have the origin dimension space point. That's, for example, the language this node was created in and contains content in. You have a classification. That's basically used for internal stuff, but it says something like, okay, this is a root node, a regular node, or a tethered node, which is the new term for auto-created child nodes. Then you have the node type name and the node type. That's nothing new. You have the property collection. That's basically the old array for properties, but as an object that does some lazy loading stuff and so on. You have a node name. This is now optional. In the old world, you had to have a node name because everything was identified by path. This is no longer the case, so you can omit this actually if you want. And there are quite a few of timestamps, like when was this node created, when was it published, when was it modified, and when was the last modification published. Then one of the new kids in town are references. So that's a new concept. In the past, you had these reference properties, and if you called getProperty on that reference name, you just got the reference node, and there was no way, except with Elasticsearch, to find the referencing node. So this now goes by both directions with the references and back reference, and what you get is actually a reference object, which contains, of course, the node, then the property name, and these references can have properties themselves. So you can describe, okay, this node is related to this node in that some conditions are given also. Then we have the subtrees. That's basically an in-memory tree structure for building menus. That's basically the main use case for that. Do not confuse them with the subgraph. The subgraph is the database thingy, and the subtree is the in-memory thing, and it's just the hierarchy. You don't have references there. You don't have visibility constraints there. You just have a in-memory hierarchy of nodes, which contains the level you're currently in, the current node, and children, which are also subtrees. It's quite nice to render menus, for example. And one thing about all these queries is it's always a single SQL query to fetch all this. So even for the subtrees, we use these recursive CTEs in SQL. And yeah, it's quite fast. So these subtrees also replace the idea of find child nodes, find child nodes, find child nodes, find child node. You can just say, okay, I want a certain subtree, thank you. Okay, here's what actually happens if you do that. So you have this find node by ID. That's pretty easy, right? So you just get the node with the respective ID in either language, because this German A node also is available in the Luxembourgish perspective. Find child nodes will return the child nodes, obviously, A and B for the root node R. Descendant nodes, that's also one of these recursive thingies. It's just like a subtree, just without the hierarchy information. So it's just a plain list. You have the parent node that you can find, the succeeding sibling, that's something new. So you can find B for A, for example, or the preceding sibling, which is A for B. You can find references. So what you find is a reference to B. You don't actually get the node itself. You get a reference containing the node. And one new operation is the back references. So you can find all nodes that reference B, for example. Then this is what these subtree structures look like. They're quite similar to the content graph itself, but it's always some portion of it. So one parameter we have where it makes sense, actually. Some of the subgraph methods can be filtered. It's similar to what previously we did in memory in PHP. We're using flow query. This can be now done on the database side. You can add like node type constraints. So, for example, for fetching a subtree, all the children or descendants, everywhere where it makes sense. You can filter by node type. You can set certain property values. So, for example, give me all news articles with a title this and that. It's similar to the flow query builder, I guess. And you can also add ordering and pagination. So far for the read side, I mean, to recap, what you usually do is inject that content repository registry, get your content repository, select your perspective, find the subgraph by that perspective parameters, and just query away. So now, the right side, where things get a bit more interesting, at least internally. We don't have this active record got object anymore, right? In the old world, you had this node, and you could say a node set property or node create another node of certain type with certain properties, and then it just would, these new nodes or modified nodes would just save or update themselves to the database. That's no longer the case. These properties of the node, for example, are even read-only. I mean, you can still change them by reflection or object access and flow, but that won't do anything except probably confuse your presentation layer. It won't save to the database anymore. Also, if you create just a new node object, that's pretty easy and actually really neat for writing tests. You can just now say new node, add a few parameters, and test with it. But this will also never be saved to the database. So we write nodes in a different type now, in a different kind. We send commands. And there is one thing to keep in mind. Writing nodes is, most of the time is about identity, right? You want to write a node in a certain language, and this language is now identity, part of the identity of the node. Or if you want to change properties, you do that on an origin dimension space point. So you select the identity, you select a certain node, and change something in it. So fallbacks are not important here. We just assume they exist later on for the read side. The only thing where perspective is relevant is if you want to change some things that impact the fallbacks themselves. For example, in the old world, you could you have this node in German, and it's also visible in Luxembourgish, and now you delete it in Luxembourgish, then it's gone in your workspace until you press publish, then it's there again because the fallback is still in place. This actually works differently in the new CR, because if you delete a node, this node just in Luxembourgish, it will actually remove this fallback as the fallback mechanism is projected to the database. So then this node is no longer available in Luxembourg. And that's where you have to target this Luxembourgish dimension space point, where the node doesn't, there is no Luxembourgish version of this. So you don't target the node's identity, but only the perspective where you don't want it to be available anymore. We'll have a look at that in detail. Yes, these commands are a bit more complicated than the queries, but it's manageable. So we have this, as I already said, this origin dimension space point. So it's a concept of identity. Where was this node created in what language, for example? Then when we have commands, we just send them to the content repository. So you just create a new command, for example, create a node aggregate with node, set the parameters, say content repository, handle this, and you're done. And again, in the past, you first needed to fetch a node before you could create a new node. That's no longer needed because all these commands also work with identifiers. So the most important commands are about nodes, obviously, and they basically cover the whole life cycle which a node can have. For example, you can create a root node. That's the first thing you do, obviously. Then you can create other nodes below that. Then you can create variants of those nodes, translating them, for example. You can set properties, references. You can disable nodes, enable them again, remove them, move them somewhere else, change the name, change the type, or copy nodes recursively. And that's one point where I will switch over to the IDE, because I was basically too lazy to copy just all that code to the slides. And here is one example of a rather simple command. So you want to create a new node, and that's what you want to know, or what you need to know to do that. You need, again, this content stream ID. So basically, do you want to create it in the live workspace, or maybe you have a kind of review workspace where you want to import stuff before it is published. Then you just select a different content stream ID. You have to define a node aggregate ID. That's quite nice. If you want, for example, to import products into your catalog, you could just use the product ID as a node aggregate ID, and then it's easy to find them again. Or if you're not inspired to do that, and to just say, okay, I don't really care about the identifier, just call algorithms, generate UUID, and that's fine as well. You have to specify the node type name, of course, the origin dimension space point. So, for example, if you have a language dimension, just enter the language here. If you don't have any dimensions, you also can just create an empty origin dimension space point. And the parent node, that's the parent node's ID, that's also important. There are some optional parameters. You can also state a succeeding sibling. For example, if it's added between some other nodes, you can specify where. You can add a node name if you want. You can also already set some properties. For example, that's nice for the creation dialog in the Neos UI. And you can also specify, so if this node has auto-created child nodes, you can also define the node aggregate IDs for these auto-created child nodes to make them deterministic. We use that excessively in our test cases, of course. But maybe if you have a use case where you also need that, you can use it, but it's optional. You don't have to. So let's have a look at delete. That's also rather interesting. There are quite a few commands that you can send. So delete and remove node aggregates. So here we have. So the idea is, of course, yeah, you already again you target some content stream where you want to do this. Then what node aggregate do you want to delete? Then the dimension space point you want to delete it in. For example, for example, we have this German node that's visible in German and in Luxembourgish. You can now select, okay, remove it in German, then it's gone because that's its origin. Or you can say remove it in Luxembourgish, then it's still available in German, but it's no longer available in Luxembourgish because you just deleted the fallback, basically. It's also really well documented in the code base, whatever this does. So basically, I'm just guiding you a bit through. So then there's something like a node variant selection strategy. When you had such a language fallback, for example, and you had a product catalog, and you said, okay, there is a lot of fallbacks going on, we just import the product in one language, and then we have maybe some variants for disabling that product or changing something in a different market or so on. Then you have like two actual nodes, but 10 different perspectives to look at them. Then deleting that product was quite interesting because you had to find, okay, in which languages or markets or dimension space points do I actually have to delete this node? It took me quite a while to figure this out, and it wasn't really that nice. That got a bit easier because you now can just select the variants that have to be deleted. You can say, okay, only delete this variant or all specializations, or just remove the whole node aggregate. So you can just do this with one command. And then there is the so-called node aggregate ID for the removal attachment point. That's something for the Neos UI, so that it knows where something was deleted. The CR itself doesn't really need it that much. I'm not sure if it's deprecated. Either way, it's optional. You don't really need to set that. So that's basically the idea of the whole commands. They all look similar. All parameters are quite well documented. Most parameters also reappear from time to time, like the content stream ID is always there. And I mean, you operate on a node aggregate. It would be nice to add its ID as a parameter. You have some kind of dimension space point, either origin or regular one for coverage, to target the node you actually want to modify or the operation you want to perform. And everything you put in there are value objects that are themselves well documented. You can't possibly do anything wrong, I guess. Okay, so back to here. There are a few workspace operations. You don't really do that often. This is mostly done with the NeoCI, for example. But of course, you can do it if you don't use Neos itself, but just the CR. Create workspaces, root workspace. Then you can change the base workspace, the workspace owner, rename them, delete them. Then we have this publish or publish individual nodes, and the same for discard. That's what you also can do in the NeoCI. In this orange button thingy in the top right corner. And you can now rebase workspaces, which means you no longer have fallbacks to the live workspace as you have in the old CR. They can differ quite a lot from the live workspace. Something could be deleted in the live workspace, and you won't see that in your workspace until it's rebased, and that's basically just like git rebase, so all the events and commands that were applied in the meantime in the live workspace or in your base workspace will then be applied to your workspace, at least until the point it crashes, but that can actually happen, right? So you modified something in some node and someone else deleted it, so there's nothing to modify anymore. And then that's the time the editors should speak to another what's going on here. Okay, then we have some dimension adjustments that got necessary since the fallback mechanism is now a write-side problem and no longer a read-side problem. So for example, these root nodes, they are always available in all dimension space points. So if you add a dimension space point by, for example, adding a new language variant or something like that, then this has to be adjusted in the database as well. That's what this update root node aggregate dimensions command is for. Yeah, then we have add dimension shine through, and I guess there will be a remove as well. For example, if you add another language with fallback to someone else, also to some other language, then these fallback edges in the graph have to be added as well. And you can, of course, move dimension space points, for example, if you rename a language or something like that. So besides reading and writing, there are some utilities. So as I said, this content repository object is basically a facade for all the services included there per content repository. So each content repository has its own node type manager. You can fetch arbitrary projection states. For example, if you write your own projections for this content repository, you can fetch them there. For the usual projections like the content graph, workspace finder, content stream finder, there are separate methods for getting those. You can get the variation graph if you want to have information about this dimension space thingy. For example, what dimension space points are available. For example, if you want to build a language menu or something. But usually you don't get in contact with that too much. And the content dimension source if you just want to know, okay, which dimensions are there. The future. I don't think that a content repository is ever finished. So basically, we're now at a point where we can start with the fun stuff. Something I'd like to introduce is additional query capabilities. There's a nice graph querying language called Cypher from Neo4j, which is a graph database, which also would make sense as a database adapter, I guess. I mean, writing a graph into a graph database could make sense. And one other thought are some kind of ACL relations where you can control who can access what node, for example. This will have impact on future versions of the API, but it's basically just adding new commands and so on. So that's it for me. I guess there are quite a few questions, I guess. The most important thing that I want to also say is that, yeah, have fun using Neos 9, try it out, do it. I guess it sounds a lot scarier than it actually is. And yeah, I'm quite optimistic that this transition phase from 8 to 9 will work out quite nicely. So, thanks.
You are right. You are right, there are a ton of questions. Not because you didn't explain it well, but because it's a very complex topic. Do you want to start? Should I
Okay,
start?
sure. So now that back references are implemented in the CR, is it also planned to make references editable from both sides in the Neos UI?
Possible, not yet, but yeah, there's nothing standing in the way of implementing such an editor, right? It can just be done now.
So just
Do it.
check out your 9.0 installation and get started. That would be great.
Yes.
Can I eagerly load a set of properties when fetching nodes? Couldn't the lazy loading of properties lead to 1+n select issues?
Again, please. Yes, I guess if you do reference a lot of flow entities and the likes in node properties, and you're a bit uncareful doing that, yes, you could just screw up your query, I guess, but that's then part of Flow's object manager to take care of. So not our problem. No, I think it will just work out as it worked out before, right? And plus, what you actually should do is, instead of referencing Flow entities as a property, use a reference to another node.
Staying with references to other nodes, as they are now their own thing, would that mean that they could be timeable and sortable and hideable and all that?
I think so. I mean, timeable is a different thing. We want to do this timing somewhere else. So, like, we schedule a disable or a dereference instead of setting a timeable on there. They cannot be disabled yet, but it could make sense if the use case arrives. It's totally possible.
Cool.
All right. The esteemed audience would also like to know whether find by path can be sped up by a projection.
We could do that, of course. It would not be the funniest projection to write because paths change all the time, especially across dimensions. Did I mention that move node was my final boss when implementing this? Yeah, we could do that if paths become a thing again. But to be honest, I think we almost managed to completely erase them from the Neos code base. They're massively overrated.
It's true. So when the editor deletes the Luxembourg node, that was from your example when you showed that the fallback is removed. So is this case possible via the backend, and how can this normal fallback restored again?
Yes, that's in preparation. This restoration, it's a new command. I'm not sure if the UI has the capabilities yet, but the restoration, it's already done for Postgres. I just have to migrate it back to MySQL, and then I think it will be in 9.0. Then this restoration is, of course, not available in the Neos UI yet.
Because we couldn't do it before.
Yeah, it was a no problem before. So yeah, that's something that could be added quite easily, actually.
All right. Is the new CR creating a node copy for each workspace or only for changed nodes as in NEOS 8? If all nodes are created, is there an automatic rebase mechanism?
We don't copy nodes until necessary, so this is basically copy on write, what we implemented. And instead of copying all nodes, we only copy all edges, all hierarchy edges. That's what's happening internally. And rebasing, I'm not sure when it happens, or if it's maybe you can add it as a cron job. I think it always happens if you re-log into the NEOS backend, but I'm not 100% sure right now. But yeah, you could do this yourself in question.
Cool.
Last one.
So are changes already being refactored by Rector? So the changes that need to be made to your code base when you update, I guess, is the idea.
I think that's what Sebastian talked about in his talk. So yes, there are Rector rules for adjusting your code base in Fusion, YAML, and PHP. They're probably not complete yet because we only did this on docs and NEOS.io. So that's another point for updating early. We are really happy if you run into issues so we can fix them before the release.
Cool. That's it.
Thank you so much, Bernhard.
Yeah, thank you.
Don't forget to rate the talk. Yeah, and in an attempt to stay on schedule, we'll see you back here in 10.
Cool. Yes.
Or down there in
Or
10.
down there. But up here.
Yep, I'm on. Hi. I keep trying to find a good window to start, but everybody just kept coming in. I'm flying solo now, which is horrifying. But there's a good reason that I'm flying solo. It's because I'm announcing my co-host. I really, really don't think I need an introduction for any of these three guys, because they've already been introduced, and because if you're here, you probably know them. Please don't let that stop you from giving them a huge round of applause for Robert, Carsten, and Christian.
Thank you, Maya. That sounded like David Letterman's show. My next guest doesn't need introduction. We're flattered. Yeah. So, well, this is a bit spontaneous. We're kind of a drop-in replacement. No, not really drop-in replacement, but a replacement.
We couldn't replace.
We're incompatible.
Sebastian Herzl's talk, who sadly is sick at home and can't join us here. So we had that task to spontaneously come up with something. And so Carsten and Christian mostly prepared something from our project diaries, and so we want to share a bit what we found, like the curious, useful, and nasty, and hope that you'll get some insights from that.
Exactly. So usually people don't read the fine print, so you don't need to really pay attention to that. But I wanted to say that, I mean, we see a lot of things in a very wide variety of projects, and oftentimes we think, this can be done different, and this can be done in a better way, but there's no silver bullet in IT, usually. So there's always, a discussion point maybe, and you can then argue about, yeah, but we did it because this and that back then, and that oftentimes makes sense. And so it's not bad per se what we see in most of the cases. And if you actually recognize your own code maybe, or think, this is probably about that project of ours, don't worry. It could be, but it's not necessarily your code. It could be someone else's that's just doing the same weird or interesting things.
Maybe it helps to understand this, that, I mean, this is our whole company now, so this is the truck factor here on stage, so if something drops down from the ceiling. And what we partly do is, what we do, and I have to emphasize, not for financial reasons, but for fun reasons, we offer some developer help desk to agencies. So you can drop some Neos or Flow questions in our ticket system, and we'll give our best to answer them. And yeah, so we know a lot of projects of all different kinds of sizes, and usually I would say from this conference, like half of the companies who are here are our customers somehow. And this is what we draw from, right?
Exactly.
So
I guess I try to put the things that we collected into categories. So they are not named nasty and curious and
things
ugly. So ugly, but it's more like, okay, what you maybe should or should not do. And one thing is, don't try to work against the framework. Or, as you could say very fittingly in our case, is go with the flow. Because sometimes we see code where you go like, okay, this looks weird to me. I can see where this is coming from because someone read documentation on, for example, a library that we wrap specifically for Flow use, but someone didn't realize that and looked at the original library's documentation and used what they found there to implement things. So one nice example of this is people using SwiftMailer in Flow and Neos projects, which is perfectly fine if you ignore the, well, SwiftMailer has been deprecated thing. But let's just don't put that aside for now. So SwiftMailer used that as we intended to you to use it because we have this Neos SwiftMailer package, which pulls in SwiftMailer as a dependency and does some nice wrapping around that. So recently I had this project where mails were being sent, and I obviously did not want to risk sending mails to some client directly or someone on the internet. So I configured SwiftMailer using the Neos SwiftMailer transport options to define an SMTP transport pointing to a local Mailcrab instance, which is Mailhawk or Mailcatcher or whatever. Or you could also use, I don't know, something else. So that's what I wanted to do. So I called up the page and submitted something, and I got an exception saying, well, undefined key host in this transport. I was like, what? Why? I configured it, and it should just work. So I looked at the code, and this is actually a snippet of the code that I saw. So what it does is it injects settings somewhere further up on screen. And then it uses those settings to manually build a Swift SMTP transport instance, registers a plugin for logging there. And if you look closely, it even has this comment, or to use the echo logger, which is like, okay, this comes from some example in some documentation. So you can now do this or use this plugin. So, okay, maybe, I don't know. That's why I always delete comments when I copy something from Stack Overflow, so you can't, right? And then it creates a message using new Swift message. And that is all kind of, because this thing up there is what caused the exception message for me. Because obviously, well, I did configure something else. I configured a completely different transport. So why does it do this here? And it does hard-coded logging calls. So why would I do that? Probably to find out if my actually mail-sending code would work, but I can do that in a different way. Or maybe I don't trust anything in there to work at all, so I do logging, whatever. So I eventually stripped that down a bit. Because if you create an actual Neos SwiftMailer message, you can just tell that mail to send itself. And it will then magically use whatever transport you have configured. You could also do a logging transport or an mbox transport. It's less code. And if you want to have the logging, then use the logging transport. If you want to send it as we intended to. It makes your life easier, and it allows to actually use the centralized configuration.
I'm curious when we'll find out that they're code snippets, and we see by the comments that they're created with ChatGPT, right?
Yeah, that'll be interesting. But we'll never know, probably, because ChatGPT itself doesn't even know where it took the
we'll
example
recognize
from.
the style.
It could be. So another example that goes into the same direction, handling persistent resources. Back in the days when we were still young and Flow was on the verge of becoming an existing thing, Robert thought a lot about how to handle resources, and that relying on a file system might not be a good idea, because you could use something in the cloud eventually. That was like pre-cloud days, where cloud was like, oh yeah, maybe at some point in
when
time.
Cloud was still bad weather, yes.
Yeah. So I saw this, which, well, yeah, okay, it does some importing and it checks something, and then it imports a file and it reads that file, and yeah, but what is this? So it creates a document, it adds it to the repository and persists it. Why does it do that? Okay, so it ends up in the place the next line is expecting it to be in, which is resources persistent, and then it does the manual hash splitting thing, and then it uses that path and file name to read the file. So
who actually worked on a PHP level with persistent resources already?
Oh, that's quite a few.
Okay. Maybe we need to explain that a bit, because not everyone has been doing that. Because the whole idea of this concept of persistent resources is that all files which you can upload, like images or so, which are not static in your Git code, that they have an abstraction. So we don't want to let you work with paths, because it could be that these files are actually not in a local file system, but in a cloud storage, for example. So this looks a bit like someone didn't get that first idea of persistent resources, because now you have these hard-coded path again. But for example, in our case, you would never find that file again on such a path.
No,
That
in
doesn't
Beach
exist.
there isn't any file there. It's in Google Cloud, so it's somewhere else, and you shouldn't even want to know. And also, even if you had been using file storage, it could still be at a different place if someone changed the configuration, because this fan out of the files into directories, first letter of the hash, second, third, fourth, that can be switched off and on. And so it could be different on a different system with a different configuration. So you could do this instead. The slide might look broken, but I tried to keep the line that has been kept on the same line. So what you see is all this, make it a document. There's even more code down below, which then deletes it again and persists again. So but all that is gone, and what you just do is you want to use a file function on a file that is actually in the file system. Okay, there is create temporary local copy on a persistent resource. So if you didn't know that, now you know, and you can get rid of quite a few lines of code. And this works even with the cloud storage, because it will just pull it down, put it into a temporary location on your file system, and you can work with that.
Or you just use the stream and don't have any local.
Or you just use the stream. Yeah. You could work in very different ways also with a CSV import. This is like, you could optimize this further, obviously.
Yeah.
But as far as flow goes, this is already a lot better.
You can also just get the data from the persistent resource.
Yeah. Anyway, so next topic, which is kind of, this has been deleting lines, so keep it lean and clean is the next thing you should always try to do to your code base. And there's this bullet point, MIST dependencies is what I called it. Sometimes when we get into a project, it's often because we are tasked with updating something. We do update all the dependencies. And then the first thing is, so what dependencies are there, and are they actually needed, and which part of the system actually needs which of these dependencies? And then sometimes you see this huge composer manifest at the project level, the root manifest, and it has all the dependencies. And then some of the packages in distribution packages, this one has actually 3 dependencies, but with a _star constraint, so no further narrowing of the scope. These other 3 packages don't have any dependencies declared. And then you look into the code and you find out, well, they are actually using these dependencies. So what I would always advise is declare dependencies in the package actually using them, because it makes it a lot easier to find out what you need to change, or what packages you potentially need to touch when you update a specific dependency. Also, it makes the whole dependency resolution step in Composer quite a bit faster. So,
how do you handle that in your projects? Who's responsible for updating dependencies? Do you have, like, when someone sees it, or is there a specific... Do you have any strategy for that?
Just do it. Wow.
I think any strategy or non-strategy is completely fine, unless you do that in your CI pipeline. Please never do that. Never let Jenkins do Composer update, please. Yes.
I can subscribe to that. Yeah, definitely.
And we say that because we've seen that.
We've seen it all. Also, we've seen the opposite. Like, no, I don't do Composer update. I don't touch this log file. Someone else can do it. And then everyone thinks that, and then it's not updated.
Oh, there's even something worse than CI pipeline. Those projects which develop on the production server. where they do Composer update on the live side. That's an extra.
It has been a while though. I don't know.
No, it hasn't.
It's not
hasn't?
me, not me.
No,
Okay.
I recently had one of those.
My clients do that by now. Whatever. So exactly. So let's say you find some dependency you need to update. Why would that be? And why would that be a problem to have to know why this specific dependency is actually in use? So the next thing is dependencies versus syntactic sugar, which is sometimes I recently had to update a project, and there was a specific package blocking an update to Neos 7.3 because it required a Guzzle version 6 something that I needed to update. So I was like, okay, let's hope this is not going to be a blocker. And then I looked at what does this package actually do, and it turns out that the package was a wrapper for Guzzle. So, okay, maybe it's not that hard to fix, I thought. So I checked, and yes, this package actually did not even have a newer version allowing the newer Guzzle version. So I looked into what it actually does, and I found this code, which says, okay, response is ZTTP as JSON, URL, and then some parameters. And it gets back a response, and if it's success, it creates a token from this API response. Okay. So I looked at that, and I looked into the asJSON method, and I thought, okay, this does a few things like error checking and so on that are obviously, if you do a library and do it the proper way, you would need to do that. But I could do with less code than that. So I decided to throw out that dependency so I could update and replace it with this. Do you spot the difference?
The ZTTP is missing. That was nice. I like that.
Yeah. So it's actually it's one line at the top, new client. Yeah. Okay. So that's.
But if you would use ZTTP, you could have saved that line.
Yeah. And I could
with just one extra dependency.
And it's one array level more. Yeah. You see that JSON thing? And also there's no is success on a Guzzle response. But I mean honestly, pulling in a dependency for this kind of ease of use is, I think, something you should consider carefully at least. Do you really need that? Or maybe you can use something that's already there.
You have to be technologieoffen.
Yeah, technologieoffen, okay. It's the same technology under the hood, so, okay. Which then in the end comes down to, okay, try to remove as much as possible, always. Whenever you touch your code, updating it, cleaning it up, or adding new features, try to remove things along the way, Don't leave commented stuff lying there for ages. Get it back from Git, get it back from, well, you can always get it back from Git. You don't need to comment it. If you think, okay, maybe I forget about the fact that I had it once there and just take a note somewhere,
Do you know the Boy Scout rule? Who knows that? Yeah, oh. It's not making a fire with your code. It's like doing a good what do you call that? Deed, deed. Right. So if you have a task and you solve it in your code, and then just a few lines above you see something dirty, then clean it up as well, right? So that's the Boy Scout rule, and it helps a lot because every time you work on your code, it gets a bit cleaner.
Yeah, leave a place cleaner than you find it. And that includes removing settings. I mean, sometimes you just, okay, it's easy to find classes that are no longer used and remove them and remove template files maybe. But even settings, I mean, I found this, and I know that I think the usage of Magic Wand was an experiment at that project, in that project at some point in time, and so it probably never got really used. But I know that the Lilith's capture package was actually used at some point, but that has been dropped quite a while ago. But these settings were still there. And in the end, that always means if you look at the settings file, you cannot be sure if it's still needed. It might be gone already. And there might be, I don't know, credentials in there that are no longer used, but maybe still valid, so you're carrying around those in vulnerable places and stuff like that. So really clean up after your if you remove something, just get rid of all the remains that you had at some point.
Oh, that's me.
That's you. He's the value object.
I'm the value object. Goodbye. So, who's already actively using PHP 8.2 in their project? Wow. Look, Derek as well. For PHP. Yeah. That's nice. Yeah, and as you know, the plan is that Flow 9 will actually require PHP 8.2, which is nice because then you can rely on being able to use PHP 8.2 features. It's not just being compatible, but actually use it. And I've been going through projects for a while now this year and refactored them from mostly PHP 7.4 to 8.2. And that is a complete, this is a paradigm shift. This completely changed my code style, especially when I was working with something like DTOs, data transfer objects, read models, and the like, and value objects. So what I want to recommend is try to use value objects wherever you can. So do you know what a value object is? Yeah. So let's look at I would say, modern value object. Of course, I'm also just sitting in my cave and doing my thing, so I don't know if that is actually state of the art for everyone, but this is just a class. It's a final class. It has a constructor, and if you don't know that yet, from PHP 8, these are promoted properties. So that means this constructor will require that you pass it a domain name, organization identifier, and all that, and will automatically set these as public properties of this class, and additionally make that read-only. So that was something you couldn't do with PHP 7, of course. There you would have a constructor and then getter methods to make these properties read-only, right? So this can now neatly be done just with a constructor, and that's the whole class you need. So this is now an immutable value object. So there are a few specialities I want to mention. So first of all, you see that there are 3 properties which are optional, or actually they are nullable. You still need to pass them. You still need to pass null if you want to skip them, but they can be null. And that is also something I changed over the time. I very seldom use optional arguments in methods. So imagine you have some kind of method and then you have a flag like retry, and that is true by default or something. So previously I would say I define a good default and make that argument optional, but I don't do that anymore because I think it's better to explicitly have to state what you want. Even if true would be a good default, it might be that you want to add additional arguments over the time, and then what do you do with the optional argument in the middle? You have to put it at the end and so on. So these here are kind of optional, or actually it says they might be there, they might exist or not, but you have to be aware that they can be set. Okay, let's go a bit further. Validation. So the argument for using value objects is that you can be sure that the values are already validated. At least syntactically they are right. Okay, so if I use this domain value object or model, it's a model because it's composed of value objects. Okay, but I can be sure that the domain name, for example, is valid. Or in this case, I can be sure that the passed domain name SHA-1 actually matches the given domain name. It doesn't really matter what it's doing here, but just the point, do that in the constructor right away so that you can be sure this whole model here is validated. Now we have a bit of a problem with the space down there, but you see, you can also add additional properties which are read-only, which are not passed, but can be used as a convenience later on. So for example, is this domain in use? That can be automatically determined because either it's assigned or redirected, and if it's either assigned or redirected, it's in use. And now I have a little convenience property I can always use in my code if this domain is in use. And you can set that directly in the constructor as well. Yeah, somehow that got broken again. It's funny. We had a little transfer problem with, it looked different on my machine. It's really weird. It doesn't have to do with fonts. Anyway, so
if someone knows a good testing tool for Keynote presentations,
yeah, end-to-end
let us know.
testing for Keynote. So just one last thing I want to show here. There's this public property domain status. And previously that has been a huge hack. Like at some point when I was preparing a view, I wanted to add some information which is not persisted anywhere or not in a projection, but it's like, in this moment, I want to add the status of some DNS whatnot. Okay? So previously I might even have used a dynamic property. Just set a new public property because it's used in the view. And this would be the more cleaner version of it. So there's a public property, it's not read-only, it's nullable, but it's a value object or even a model domain status. So either it's null or I can be sure that there is a domain status which is fully validated and I can use that in my view. So this is, I mean, because not everything is always completely clean and so on, but this is a okay way to afterwards add information to that value object model thing. Okay. And now finally, what do you do with this? You actually can use that, of course, in projection, for example, if you're using event sourcing, or use that with DBAL as a read model. And in order to create that, what has changed now? Nothing really. You might add some from array method, which allows you to convert, for example, from a database state to this and instantiate this model here. It depends on what you have there, how that code looks like. And then you also might want to have a toArray and a JSON serialize method. And now you can use this model consisting only of value objects. There's no string, there's no integer, and so on. And use that in a range of applications like for GraphQL or for DBAL or for just passing it around or in an action or something like that. But my point is, try to use value objects wherever you can. Don't rely on strings and so on. It also helps you when you are confusing the order of arguments when you call a method. Imagine you have 10 string arguments and then make a mistake and pass the wrong string in the wrong order. That cannot happen with value objects because it must be the correct type.
Also, it makes our life a lot easier because whenever we touch code, we have this urge to, add type declarations, and if they're already there, we don't have anything to do. And if they're not, and there's lots of strings, but at some points it's actually integers being put in, or the other way around, which happens more often than you might think. It's always this, so I added these type declarations, and then at some point the test fails, and you go like, why is it an int? It said it was a string in the doc block. So that's...
Right. So
please,
I guess
please do it.
it's my turn, and as you might see, this is turning out into kind of a feedback sandwich, right? So there was Carsten with the crazy stuff in the beginning, and then Robert with the nice value objects in the middle, and now I'm back to the weird stuff.
But isn't the nasty part supposed to be in the middle? We have to. That's a weird sandwich.
Well, it's a
with a bad aftertaste, maybe.
we are in Berlin. Probably someone
Yeah.
does a burger the other way
Yeah.
around. So
Yeah.
whatever.
the
right.
nasty burger.
The nasty double. Yeah, well, whatever.
Vegan.
Carsten played into this before, but I saw this a couple of times in multi-site projects where, I mean, you could argue if that was a good idea from the start to make a multi-site project, but then starting to share node types and Fusion code in between those sites, like just including Fusion from other sites and using node types from other sites, that gets complicated really fast if you want to update, because it is super hard to figure out what is where and how you untangle it at some point. So I would advise you, if you go the multi-site route at all, then really keep it strictly separated. And you can create utility packages that just include node types or just Fusion or both, that you then depend on for your sites, but which are not sites themselves. So that's fine. I mean, then you have a shared base. That's okay. But then you also might want to inherit from those node types and create specific ones for the separate sites, so you can adjust later on. I have seen the weirdest things where properties were declared and then in another site they were just not used and stuff like that, because it was kind of the same teaser but then not, because it didn't have a slider in it or whatever. So and it's a nightmare to update and to maintain. So keep those things separated. It will help you in the long run.
By the way, also disable the demo site. And don't use the node types. I see 2 customers in this audience who I know had the demo site running for quite some time. I'm not looking at you.
The setup, you can also disable this or remove the setup from your composite JSON if you don't.
Yeah, but that's not as hard to detect.
No,
because
it's
the
true.
demo site is usually very easy to see, because you're using dimensions. No, we are not. Yeah, but you have them in your settings. Where does this come from? It's the demo site.
Yeah.
So that's the way to find it.
Another thing I have seen in a couple of projects that were a bit older, and then they came to us and were like, could you update this, is front-end build pipeline rot. And you get in there and you try to set up the site on your local machine to get an idea of what's going on. And obviously you want to see the front-end, so you want to have the front-end build as well, but it just doesn't work. So you have maybe you have some package JSON in a good case, and in the worst case you have some gulp declaration stuff, but no package JSON even. But either way, you try to install these packages from the package JSON or even the log file. That is almost amazing. And it's just so old that the dependencies are not installable at all. And then you're facing the question, do I start updating the front-end build pipeline, which was not my initial task and will probably take longer than the Neos update itself? Or do I keep it like that? I mean, what do you do with this? This is really a big problem from my perspective as a Neos developer, because I don't do so much front-end, so creating a new build pipeline is, from my perspective, not trivial, and probably is not trivial for an old project. So yeah, that's something to watch for. And then additionally, what I also see quite a lot is huge files. Especially in older projects, you have like these 1,000 lines of node types, YAML and settings, everything in one side package. Even Fusion files with like thousands of lines of Fusion, all the prototypes in one. And that, again, is a nightmare to update and to figure out and to make sense of. Ties also into the cleaning up the settings if you remove dependencies. So it helps if you have more packages, because then you can put the stuff where it belongs. So if you have a small package for base node types, you already have the node types in there, maybe a few settings for that, and maybe some Fusion for that. So that's one small space, and then you can have a package for your search integration or whatever that has a few configuration parts for that, and a bit of Fusion for that. And that makes it, to me at least, coming into a project that is sitting around for a while, much easier to understand what's going on, because it's super easy to find stuff, and it's not always the same file you touch, right? So if you start updating, you want to do it incrementally, and if it's always that one Fusion file you change, you quickly get lost in that. So having split files is super helpful for later updating and maintaining this stuff.
I have a technical question. We have, from our diary, we have 348 slides left.
Yeah,
but I
roughly.
also see that lunch is coming near.
Yeah.
Do you have like 2 specific things you want to mention, and maybe half a question from the audience after that?
I think the next 2 we should quickly go through, right?
I think we should do some. Go one further. Document and share, which if you had this front end build pipeline rot one further, it would have been a nice transition, because what I usually do is, okay, I need to build the front end. How? Oh, there's a README. Oh, it says to be written. Okay.
Exactly.
So
It usually says getting started with this library.
Even that. Well, this is Neos 3.1. Okay, no, this is not. Okay. Anyway, just go one further. So no, well, I think that is also important. No one, give it to me. Just get it. So documentation is important, and then part of that, if you come into such a project, is finding out why something has been done in a specific way, so you can actually judge if it has been intentional or was just an accident. So write meaningful commit messages. So sometimes we see this, and it's like, okay, fix. Okay, well, I don't know. Let's look at the diff then.
And have commit messages at all? Like have version management, please?
Do incremental small commits ideally, and use version control as well.
I did download files from servers frequently.
Yeah, okay.
Like there was no version. It was just whatever was on a live server. That was my...
Yeah, I usually then put that in Git for...
Oh,
yeah, of course.
Actually, you might search for these commit hashes in the internet and see who that was.
No, they don't exist. I changed them manually. So, because, IP and everything. But sometimes you have this, which is a bit better. So it has ticket numbers. Yeah. Okay. Do I have access to the ticket system? Yeah, we can arrange that. 3 weeks pass. Okay, you have access to the ticket system, and you see this, which makes sense. At the time you write this, it's totally clear what this is about, because this test server is broken right now, and you need to fix it. And you need to fix it today. So why should you write anything further? It's totally obvious, except starting tomorrow, it's no longer totally obvious.
And the next commit message would be fix it again, or really, or now really.
That's true. So I would recommend to do it rather like this. It's not really important what it's saying there, but even if there is a ticket that says what this was about, also write meaningful commit messages. Really do that, which is part of work on your project documentation. So really do that.
Right. So the documentation, as you mentioned, the README, the empty README is not the worst case, but one of the worst cases you can have.
It's at least disappointing.
Yeah, it's
time.
quite disappointing. I mean, if you want to have it perfectly prepared for everyone coming into the project, please have information about the front-end build pipeline that is not rotting, but current, and some idea how to build this stuff and how to install it. Then maybe have some information how you set this up on a dev machine. Like, do you use DDEV or something else? Do you use local beach? Anything? Is there some Docker information? What do I do to create it, to run it? Then also maybe some information about ops dependencies. So do you need anything outside of PHP and the web server and the database? Is there any special stuff, Elasticsearch or anything else that you need? Then how do you usually deploy it? Like, is there deployment scripts in that repository, or is it somewhere else? But at least some information how that is usually deployed. And then finally, some what I call special stuff. Like, do you have special caches that need to be flashed on a deployment, or is there some external APIs that need to be accessible for you to...
Or only deploy at midnight. Or
Exactly, yeah.
Never on a Friday.
Yeah, full moon, stuff like that. Always check the full moon website appearance because it looks different, and we need to make sure that it works. So that kind of stuff, I would expect that in a README, and it would be super great if you do that.
Yeah. So we'll just do it like this. So you can later on stop the YouTube video and look at the slides that we would have talked about still.
And there's some subliminal message included in every slide. So all the explanation is when you play it very slowly. Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes even backwards. So that's it from our side. Do you have any questions? They do.
No.
Oh no.
Maybe, hi. Mark Henry is concerned about models with 2 array calls with further 2 array calls inside the 2 array calls, because he's worried about unexpected or hard to control dependencies, and asks, wouldn't it be better to have a separate class to translate the whole model tree to an array instead of letting the responsibility be in the model?
It depends.
I've heard that yesterday from someone else.
It really depends. In my
viewers at
case,
home.
this was the right solution, but yes, and you can have factories and whatnot. It depends, really. There's no
If you need it, you need it.
Remember
If you
the
need
second
it, yeah.
slide? There's no syllable. There's not the one way to do it most of the time.
And for example, if you use, I use that with GraphQL, and sometimes you need you have a customer account, but you also want to have the billing address, but you don't want to put it in there, so you might add a billing address query property, which returns a query which you can use to get the billing address. That's also like a cheat, but it works. Nice. So I do that.
Whatever you do not have a shot every time a speaker answers with "it depends" will hurt you. Okay, another question that just came in is, can you supply a best practice for README files? It's quite hard to evaluate what is the best practice and MVP for READMEs.
I guess I had a good explanation just now, but I mean, I would be willing to set up...
I don't know. I usually try to remember the last README that I opened where I thought, okay, cool, that's nice, and try to use that as a mental template. I mean, the order usually is, okay, how do I get the code, which at that point most of the time is already no longer needed because I'm looking at it. But from there on, so how to set it up, how to get it running, and then maybe an overview of what are the important parts, anything that is not obvious, and then try to think not obvious to you. Okay, so not obvious to someone looking at this from a fresh perspective, and try to describe that really. But maybe we should at some point just create the template.
Some companies actually have standards for that, and I like that. So maybe, I mean, it depends. You have to sit together in your team and come up with a nice template which explains everything to newbies.
But we could make one.
The audience has a suggestion that you're going to really like, I think. Someone in here suggested that they found out that ChatGPT can help a lot in writing a README documentation from your code, which one can then edit and enhance manually, so no excuse for bad READMEs.
And it's usually 80% correct. That helps a lot.
Yeah.
Just make sure you remove the rest of the 20%.
Yeah, you need to check it afterwards. Okay, cool. Need to try that.
Last question. Keep it brief, and I want an answer from each one of you.
Okay.
Because this question came in like right after your talk started, so it has nothing to do with the talk. I think this is an actual
Now I'm
question
curious.
to you. What are the best tips that you can give to someone who just started out using NEAS? I'm going to step in, join the contribution day. I'm going to take that one for myself.
I guess definitely join all the channels, join Discuss, join Slack. Go ahead and ask questions. No one bites you. No one is expecting everyone to know everything. Even simple questions, it's no problem. People will answer even the simplest question. There's no dumb questions, no wrong questions. Really ask, because we are there and we will help you. Like this is the basic thing. Just go in there. Obviously use the documentation and the examples that are around the web, but if you don't know, just ask. It's perfectly fine.
It boils down to don't be afraid. We don't bite. And then really try to also not be afraid of trying out things. You know, I mean, look at all the stuff that's there. Look at the documentation. Look at the code that is in our public repositories, and then just play around with it. Be curious, and then push out whatever results you have, and have it looked at by others to help you improve, which is usually a very good idea.
And don't be afraid to, if you don't find the answer directly, then don't be afraid to look into the code, actually. It's, the PHP code is quite understandable for many, and it can give you insights in how things worked. And don't look everywhere, just get a step deeper into the code, and you'll find most answers. And actually, you can also download, for example, docs.neos.io. The whole source code is on GitHub. Maybe that is also good for getting started to see an actual website in action. You can learn from those examples.
Thank you so much. We're
Thank
practically
you.
on time, too. Don't forget to rate the talks. Welcome back, everyone.
Last talk in this room. Remember that after the lunch break, it will be in the gallery room.
And last talk before lunch,
Exactly.
which is super important.
Yeah.
Our next speaker, actually, like the timing couldn't have been better, is a really good follow-up to the previous talk in here. He initially wanted to drop an F-bomb in the title of his talk. We cleaned that up for the kids. But as a firefighter, he can show us what to do when your project is set ablaze. So please help us in welcoming Anjan to the stage. And don't forget to submit your questions. Thank you.
Hi. So, welcome to my talk. Hello, NeosCon. I'm super honored to speak here today. And I want to talk about how to screw up a Neos project and some lessons that we learn from it. Learn from the mistakes of others because you can't live long enough to make them all yourself. Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States, said this, and this is the reason why we are here today, so that you maybe can learn from the mistakes that we at Tech Division made. I want to share some mistakes that we made we started to develop Neos projects in 2013 and built a lot of small and larger scale projects since then. And we gathered a lot of experiences along the way, but we also made some mistakes that I want to share with you. In general, I want to share mistakes in Neos projects, and I want to provide some ideas or some advices on how to avoid those issues. A quick disclaimer before we start. All of the topics shown are real-world examples. It's code that we have produced, but they have simplified and anonymized for obvious reasons, I guess. So let's have some Schadenfreude together, and in the best case, I offer to offer some insights in the problems. The first screw up. What's the situation that we were in? What's the context for this problem? It's a fairly old project with over 6 years age, and we continuously develop features, build some new stuff. The customer wanted some new features, and so it's a ever-evolving project. And it got regular updates. So far, so good. It had over 20 languages, and in general, a fairly active project with around 4,000 commits. And we wanted to update to Neos 7.3. It's a bit ago, so Neos 7.3 was state of the art. And in the update process, we noticed some missing child nodes. I guess everyone here in this room has experienced issues with the content repository, which is all the better to get the new content repository. Some child nodes were missing, and it's unclear what the exact reason for this was. Probably because the authors copy and pasted between multiple languages, which might have caused the problem, but in general, as I said, it's a very large project with multiple editors, multiple authors, so stuff like that happens. So what do you do if you want to fix issues in the content repository? You try a node repair. So did we. We run it on our local machines and got greeted by the following screen. 25,000 missing default values, 5,000 orphan nodes, which the node repair wanted to remove, 4,000 missing child nodes, and 2,000 disallowed nodes. The exact numbers I don't know, but it was somewhere in the order of this. So, yeah, well, it was not so great day. So, how can we solve this problem, or how did we solve this problem? For the first part, the adding default properties shouldn't destroy anything. Overall, it's a default property, so you can just add it, right? To be sure, we made some backstop tests with backstop.js to have a kind of broad overview, but yeah, for a project in this size, I think it's a quite nice way to quickly see if there are major things broken. So we made some backstop tests to always have a reference and to quickly compare before and after the node repair. We manually checked the missing child nodes, and we checked the orphan nodes and fixed some of them manually. But in addition, we also wrote custom node migrations just to get this problem into a more manageable state and to to clearly see what the problem is and to decide by ourselves what we want to do with the orphan nodes and so on. In the end, it was a multi-step script to execute the migrations as granularly as possible and to execute the node repair in multiple steps, because there were also edge cases involved where you can't run the node repair because the child node is missing, but the child node can't be created because the parent node is invalid and so on. So with this multi-step script, we managed to get the content repository in a clean state and into a manageable state again. Yeah, what did we learn from this? So first of all, don't neglect your content repository and leave it unattended for multiple years. I guess this goes without saying, but yeah, if there are as many authors that we have had, yeah, you need to check it regularly and try to update it and yeah, help the authors manage it and help to keep the content repository in a clean state. Also consider you to include the node repair into regular maintenance. I don't know if you update the project every month, include the node repair task in there, and yeah, try to be careful what the node repair actually does, and that you don't actually accidentally remove any nodes that should be still there, but the customer misconfigured something or misused the NEOS system. Also consider including non-destructive node repair tasks into your deployment. For example, adding new default values. If you do this regularly, and especially if you do this with every deployment where you add new default values, there shouldn't be a problem if you include the node repair for add missing default values. There are also other node repair, don't know what this is called, tasks that you can include, which should, in theory, be non-destructive. And yeah, be mindful about the implications of a node repair. As I said, it can remove nodes that are still needed, or that just somehow got lost. The next screw up. Again, just a little bit of context. How did we get into this situation? We built an importer who imports products as document nodes. We are importing those products into a separate workspace just for reasons that the customer can review the import and maybe decide, hey, there's a product that I don't want or stuff like that. So we import it into a separate workspace. But of course, then we need to publish these changes into the live workspace. And at least from my experience, publishing 4,000 nodes takes about 4 minutes, and publishing 8,000 nodes takes 30 minutes. So if you try to publish larger workspaces than 8,000 nodes, most likely the publish will crash because it runs into a timeout or a memory limit or stuff like that. So our solution for this problem, we built a custom command, a custom publishing command to avoid this problem. And here is a dummy implementation how something like that might look. It's fairly simple. So we just get the source workspace, the target workspace. In this case, it's the live workspace, and we get all of the unpublished nodes for the source workspace, and then we just simply split this command simply split this array by a limit which we can provide to this function, and with that. You can avoid the scaling issues of larger publishing commands. What have we learned from this? It seems like that publishing scales with big O of n squared. I'm not exactly sure, maybe some more clever people than I am can tell me why this is the case. But I've looked at the code, and it seems like that Neos collects all nodes which needed to be published, and then iterates over all nodes and gets all child nodes for this node that also need to be published, which in the worst case can scale to big O of n squared. So the larger the amount of nodes that you want to publish, the slower the command gets overall, until a point where the whole command just crashes. But again, I'm not totally sure about this. So maybe it was just a problem in our code base, and we did some weird stuff that caused this problem. Maybe instruct your customer to keep changes inside a workspace relatively small. A few thousand nodes should be fine, but anything larger than that might cause problems. If the customer decided he wants to change 20,000 nodes, then you might consider to publish the workspace in the CLI. So just tell your customer, hey, if you have 20,000 nodes that needed to be published, just give us a quick call and we will publish them from the CLI. And just use the limit command that I showed you earlier and run it like 10 times, or depending on how much nodes you need to publish. The next screw up, again, a little bit of context, how we got into this situation. Imagine you have a multi-site project. I have I did come up with two very creative names, Site A and Site B. And you want to configure a key for an API or some other configuration which differs between the two sites. So you create a configuration in the first site package, you create a configuration in the second site package, again, very secure API keys, and then you want to read this configuration somewhere. In this case, we, for the demo purposes, we want to read this configuration inside our Fusion code. So the naive approach or the naive assumption would be that because you have configured it for one side and for the other side, that the configuration is dependent on the site that you are. But actually, this isn't the case, and instead, both of the sites get the same value, and they get the same value depending on which plugin gets loaded last. So this is a problem where we have seen a lot of, especially new Neos developers, where they stumble upon this. Yeah, you expect that the configuration is dependent on the site, but as I said, this isn't the case. So what gets loaded last will be applied to both sites. So how do we usually solve this problem? We create, it's just an arbitrary name, we create site-specific configuration. As you can see, we have this site-specific configurations and specify which site, and then again the same configuration as before, and for the other site as well. And we then just simply manipulate or extend the configuration value that we want to get with the current site node name. It's just maybe it's a workaround, but I think that it's in this way is quite clear where this configuration is coming from. Either if you look into the configuration and you see, okay, we have some site-specific configurations, but also if you look into your Fusion code, you also see that the configuration is dependent on the current node name. It doesn't need to be the node name, it can be whatever you decide that the key for this site-specific configuration needs to be, but in this case, it's an example how we sometimes do it if we run into this problem. And if you do it this way, the configuration gets loaded correctly, depending on which site you are, and you get the correct super secret API key for your very important plugin. What have we learned from this? Yeah, well, as I told already, the configuration will be merged completely and isn't site-specific. And maybe you can consider in writing a custom EEL helper, which does all of the abstraction that I showed you. And in this EEL helper, you also could include some fallbacks to the default configuration or stuff like that. You even can abstract the logic of getting the current site node name or stuff like that. The next screw up. Again, a little bit about the situation, about the context. We all know this. There are reoccurring use cases where you might want to build a plugin that you want to reuse across multiple projects. So, for example, in almost every project you need some sort of a slider or a carousel. So the approach is to build a plugin for that, or to use another plugin, but for this purpose, we decided to build a plugin for a slider. But now the problem is that every customer wants a slightly different variation of our slider. And this eventually results in overriding almost the whole plugin in each customer just to cover all the use cases, all the super special use cases of your customers in the plugin. So you have plugins, but you override half of the plugin or the whole plugin. So what's the point of the plugin anymore? A solution that we are trying to establish, at least in our own plugins, that plugins don't get a concrete rendering implementation. So you have a plugin and it has all of the pre-configured configurations, it has some logic that is abstracted in the project, but the plugin itself is not standalone. The plugin itself cannot render anything. A good example for this is the lightweight Elasticsearch from Sandstorm by Sebastian. This plugin doesn't provide any rendering, but it provides a small snippet, a small getting started, which then is intended to be copied into the project. So you read the README and there's a snippet, and you just copy the snippet into your project, and then you can do whatever you want with the rendering, but you don't have to override the original plugin. Therefore, it's completely up to the project how they want to implement the rendering. And yeah, a plugin becomes more manageable and more becomes better to maintain. And what also helps is to define a clear API in Fusion, define clear values that are intended to be overwritten or that are intended to be changed by the implementation or by the project that is using the plugin, and define values that are not intended to be changed or should be avoided to be changed and overwritten. So in general, be mindful about the extent of rendering in plugins. Consider what this plugin needs to do, and especially consider the need for customization. Think what might be some use cases where this plugin is needed, and then decide, okay, the use cases might vary so much between the projects that you decide to don't include any rendering in the plugin at all, or only small parts that are likely always to be the same. The next screw up. Who of you has seen a configuration folder that looks like this? It goes on and goes on and goes on. So quite a few. Yeah, especially in long-lasting projects of ours, which have been updated since very old versions of Neos and have accumulated countless node types over the years, because, yeah, as it should be, the customer always wants new features and wants to extend the project. So over the years, it accumulates a lot of node types, and in the worst case, all of the node types, all of the configuration is in one single configuration folder, where we have in the end 200 node types or even more. And yeah, this becomes increasingly cluttered and very confusing and hard to maintain. So how can you approach this problem? First of all, check if there are unused node types. I think there are plugins for that where you can see the usage of specific node types. So check if there are unused node types and remove them. If you don't have to maintain this code anymore because it's unused, remove it and it's not a problem anymore. Also consider splitting the configurations and splitting your code into multiple packages. Group them into similar functionalities, like you can have a package where all of your form stuff is in, you can have a package where all of your search stuff is in, you maybe have a package where you have a specialized super complicated rendering plugin for hotspots on an image with a slider over it and so on. And use the new, it's not so new anymore, but I've seen a lot of projects that still don't use this feature. Use the new feature to organize node types into subfolders. You can look it up in the documentation how this works, but you can split the configurations in node type folders and then split it further, and therefore it becomes more manageable and way easier to maintain. So what have we learned from this? Take your time to restructure your code, and oftentimes it's well worth the effort, and it's most of the time quite easy and painless to split the code into multiple packages. Of course, there are also other examples where this is very hard and you sit there for days and then decide, okay, scrap it. We will never manage to refactor this code. But in the most cases, I think it's quite easy and painless. But you get a code base that is easier to understand, and you can also maintain your project better and include new features more easy. And also, or especially for new developers or for new members for this project, it's way easier to see, okay, what's this project about? Okay, there's a package which just uses the node types, and a package which just handles the forms, and there's a package which just handles search, and I don't care about this right now, so I just look into this package where the super special hotspots thing is rendered because I need to fix a bug in there. So, that's all about my talk. I would love to hear some stories how you might have screwed up a project or some lessons that you have learned. Feel free to talk to me, especially now in lunch. And that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Anjan. We do have a couple questions that came in when you were talking about your creatively named Site 8 and Site B. Someone asked, have you considered Flow subcontext to handle site-specific configurations?
That's a good question.
They're full of good questions, these people.
Yeah. I actually don't have a well-defined opinion about that. I'm sure we can discuss this, what you exactly want to achieve. But if you build a custom EEL helper for that, you can make it whatever you want. So decide what's your use case and decide what you want to achieve, and then maybe extend your custom view helper that you've built.
So whoever asked this question, don't be shy. Step up to Anjan. Fight it out.
So, how do you solve site-specific configuration with keys or data from environment variables?
So first of all, environment variables, I've seen them in some projects, but most of the time I think that they are not really necessary, because you have the, as said, you have the context-specific configurations that you can set for a context. If you have a development environment, you can set the configuration that you need for a development environment. And if you have a production environment, you can set the production API keys and stuff like that. So I would make the argument that environment variables aren't really needed, or at least we don't use them in our projects.
Okay. When implementing plugins, have you explored implementing functionality using augmenters and configurable attributes with sane defaults?
Yes, that's a very good idea. There's a plugin by Sandstorm, is there? Which also uses or extends the functionality of Fusion components. We might want to look into this, but for now we just use the plain Fusion configurations. Yeah, so it's a good idea, and yeah, maybe we can try it.
And the last question is juicy. Christian?
Yeah, indeed. Is there any screw up that you never managed to fix?
Oh.
Don't expose yourself if you don't want to.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all of the issues that we had over the last years. Yeah, of course, a perfect example is that you have really, really old projects where the customer never wants to pay for an update and it just runs forever, and then you end up with Neos 3.1 and then the customer says, hey, now we need this new feature, and yeah, this most of the time is a case where it's a lost case, or it can be a lost case to update such old projects, but it also can work out. But we had some projects where we decided, okay, this is so old, we won't maintain this anymore, we just scrap it and write it new.
But wouldn't scrapping it kind of also solve the problem?
That's true. Scrapping the whole project is also solving the problem.
I'm trying to help you out by saying there's no problem you haven't ever not fixed.
Deleting the whole project is solving the project.
So, thank you.
That's it with the questions.
And again, thank you for rating the talk, and see you all after lunch in the other location or downstairs. But now, lunch.
Let's have some lunch.